Hello, and welcome to tonight's webinar featuring Formative Language Assessment for English Learners with Sarah Ottow. We want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's been able to join us for our fourth live event of the 2015-2016 school year. We're happy to see the familiar names of some of our Education Connections members, as well as some new participants. We're so glad you could all join us. Thanks for taking the time to be with us this evening. We'll begin today's session with a brief introduction, including an overview of Education Connections. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Sarah Ottow. Following and throughout their presentation, we'll have time reserved for questions and comments from participants. We'll be monitoring questions as they come in, and we encourage you to send along any thoughts or questions that come to mind during the presentation, using the questions box in the GoToWebinar window. During today's session, we'll also be posting some polling questions related to both your background and today's topic. Once results are in, we'll post them for you to view. At the end of the Q&A, we'll briefly wrap up and remind you of the ways to continue the conversation that we started tonight. We'll be doing some interactive activities during the webinar, but we also invite you to chat further about tonight's topic by joining us on Twitter. You can use the hashtag EdConnects, EDCONX, to participate in the conversation with Education Connections staff and your fellow educators. For those of you who may be new to Education Connections, we wanted to briefly introduce you to the community and the resources that are available. Education Connections is an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics in collaboration with the University of Oregon. It is hosted on the University of Oregon's Oberverse platform. Education Connections is a free online community providing access to a wide range of resources and bringing educators together to collaborate around implementing high-quality standards-based instruction with all students, and especially English learner students. There are many ways to participate in Education Connections. You can share ideas and ask questions in the discussion forums, find resources for use in your classroom, participate in live events such as this one, and read Tuesday's tips and Friday's fun facts, which are shared in the forums every week. Anyone is welcome to join, so we invite you to sign up today if you're already not a member. As a reminder, the Education Connections team will post a video archive of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint, and links to resources related to today's webinar. To access these resources, log on to Education Connections, click on the Webinars or Live Events tab. On your screen, you'll see a few polling questions regarding your background. We'll post these results as they come in. So tonight's first question asks, what is your current position? Please select one. Great. It looks like we have about 65% of our audience are ELL specialists and teachers, 23% are ELL coaches and consultants, while 12 of you play an administrator or leader role in your school. Our second question tonight is, with what grade levels do you primarily work? Take a second and select one. Okay, looks like 34% of you work in K through 5 grade levels, 13% of you are in grades 6 through 8, while 6% of you are in high school, 9th through 12th grade, and 28% of you place yourself within the K through 12 spectrum, and 19% of you are based within the college or university. Great. Well, at this moment, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Sarah Ottow.
Hello, and thank you, Shireen, and hello to everyone this evening. I want to make sure you can hear me and see me okay, or hear me and see my slides okay. Okay, great. Well, Again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I'm very excited to be here and to talk with you about this topic of assessing our English learners using formative measures. And just a quick note, I will use the acronym ELL. That's how we use ELLs in Massachusetts to talk about this population, and of course it means the same as EL, but just to clarify with the language lens. I really would like for you, no matter what your role, no matter what grade level you teach, as we saw, we have a wide range here, but I'd like for you to walk away tonight with at least one idea for your practice. And as Shireen said, we'd really love to hear from you, and we'll be teaching you again, showing you again how to stay in touch so that we can see how things are going on this very important issue. I will be sharing these 10 tips, as I will show you, in the culmination of a tool called a language snapshot tool that I've created in use in my practice and working with teachers, districts, and state teams. So I encourage you to take a look at that later on in the webinar and use it for your own work. We are going to be moving through this together, but first I'd like to just talk to you a little bit more about myself and where I'm coming from, in case you're wondering. Some of you I know, I've seen the participants. Hello to those of you I do, and many of you I don't. So I'm excited to learn with you this evening. The name of my organization is Confianza, and you can find us at ELLconfianza.com. It's basically a word that some of you may know if you speak Spanish or another Latin-based language. If you don't, you might want to just do a quick root word study there and look and consider that maybe it means confidence or something like that with confianza. And it does, but as many words are from one language to another, they don't translate directly. So what's special about the word confianza is that, as this picture demonstrates, relationships are everything. And really what it means is we want to have mutual trust and confidence and respect in our students so that they can be ready to learn and can be proud of who they are. This example here is from a teacher that I was privileged to work with in the Worcester Public Schools named Nicole Gerard. And as you can see, her student thinks that she's the most favorite woman in history. Confianza is actually a research-based practice. Those of you who may be familiar with the Funds of Knowledge teacher research, if you're interested to learn more about it, there's a source for you. Okay, so let's get started. We would love for you to use the question box in the control panel and fill in this sentence. Don't think too hard, just what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say assessment is. Just anything on the top of your head. Please go ahead and type your answer in. Okay. Great, all sorts of things. So checking for understanding, testing, it's necessary. A couple people are saying that. People are looking at a way to measure learning, monitoring progress, multifaceted. Beth is saying it's misunderstood. And I think that's, somebody else is saying that kind of in the same line, finding what I need to know, but often something that is just a test. So a lot of different answers here, which speaks to the complexity of this issue. It really is a complex issue, as we know, and it's not going to be something that we can totally cover tonight. But I'll just go back to this slide real quick, because as we can see with this student, it does provoke anxiety in some of us, and it does mean lots of different things to different people. So I want to just spend a couple minutes calibrating what an assessment system is and take stock, encourage you to take stock of your assessment system, because it really should be balanced. Okay, and what do I mean by that? I mean, we really need to have summative assessments in terms of formatives, but often we're overly emphasizing the summative. Okay, so that is when we look at big data, right? Like with our PARC, we have our MCAS for content, and for language, we have our access, or if we're in Output 21 state, or Texas or California, we have our own summative language measures. Of course, the interims, as we know, are more of those benchmarks that come along quarterly or by set points in time in our local context, and that gives us information on students' development against benchmarks for proficiency. And examples of that with content, of course, would be like unit tests or maps or running records, whatever your local context decides. And then examples of interims for language, you might use the model from WIDA, you might use other measures for language assessment, but there's usually not a lot in place at this point for interim. Our focus tonight is on that formative piece, and that often, again, is out of balance. And I can see from a lot of people's answers here in the chat that somebody said it's not the devil. Assessment's not the devil, but it can kind of be perceived that way. And what I often like to say is test is not a four-letter word, okay? That we've kind of co-opted the word test to mean this big data, but we want to reclaim it, and we're going to spend a little bit of time getting clear about what assessment actually is, particularly when we want to think about the English language development of our ELLs. All right, because that's what's the most important here, is to highlight things that aren't always seen. Because the language issues that our English language learners face and grow in tremendous leaps and bounds don't often get measured. And so we really want to reclaim this idea of what it means to assess. When we think about the root word of assessment, we can go back to this right here, assidere, which is Latin, and it literally means, if you know any Latin-based words, you can recognize asiento or something like that, and it literally means, as you can see, to sit with. So like this teacher is in the picture, you know, are we sitting with our students, whether it's literal rather, or figurative? The point is, are we doing assessment to our students, or are we doing it with them? Are we doing it for them? And again, we go back to the summative and interim, not always something we can do with and for them and that we can sit next to them and do. But we're going to be focusing tonight on where we do have some kind of influence, which is in formative assessment. Okay, we may not be able to change or have much to say on the larger kinds of data at play, and they have their purposes, right? Summative assessment is very important for outside stakeholders, and interim as well. Formative brings it back to the classroom. Formative is really at the heart of teaching. And when we're doing formative assessment, the lines are blurred, right, between teaching and assessing, because it's constantly giving us information for ourselves. It's constantly giving our students information about their performance and what is important for their next steps. The difference between just formative assessment and formative language assessment, just to be clear, is what I've been learning in my practice that I'm sharing with you tonight is it's this intentional focus on language. And it doesn't happen by accident, okay? So if formative assessment is the heart of teaching, formative language assessment is the heart of teaching English language learners. We need to explicitly plan for and document formative language assessment in order to rebalance our assessment systems, in order to give voice to students and their very nuanced, very complex English language development process, and in order to, I would say, empower teachers to say, this matters, this is the heart of our learning, this is what happens in the classroom. So that is what we're defining as formative language assessment. We're going to be going through these 10 tips, and I'm going to be giving you some opportunities to continue to share your ideas through a couple activities. But I do want to say, before I do that, please use the question box. If you have any comments that come up or any connections, reflections that you want to share, even if it's not a purposeful time for me to do formative assessment with you, please don't hold back, okay? We really want this to be an interactive experience. So these 10 tips and this tool that I'm going to be sharing, it's really inspired by a couple of things that I want to share with you. First is my experience as a teacher, as a ELL teacher, a classroom teacher, and after that was as a reading specialist, as a literacy specialist. And one of the takeaways for me in my journey in the classroom was that there's really strong overlap between learning to teach ELLs and learning to teach reading, right? And language and literacy are very intimately connected. So I'll be sharing with you this process that comes out of that work, as well as the other resources that I'll be sharing with you at the end, largely from our friends at WIDA. So the first tip that I really want to stress is making time to analyze student work formatively. Okay, often as we're focused on big data and we're focused on accountability, which is all very important, and we often let slide the time to look deeply at what students are doing and to have rigorous, rich conversations with each other about their performance. We know that research tells us if teachers are talking about teaching, there's a correlation to higher student performance. So if we value that, then we need to make time for it in our practice. So just a quick tip there. You know, it may not be something that you have direct control over, but this idea of coming together in our communities of practice to analyze what our students are doing together. It's very, very important. And again, go ahead and feel free to add any ideas that you have throughout. I'll be keeping an eye on the question box. The second tip that I want to discuss briefly is the assessment task itself appropriate? So in other words, sometimes we have great assessment ideas or formative assessment ideas, and they're language heavy, so they're not actually measuring what we want them to measure. Here's an example from a teacher I worked with in the Worcester Public Schools that had an exit slip around the very hungry caterpillar, as you can see. And it was a really, you know, it was a great assessment in terms of what it was measuring with content, trying to remember some pieces from the story. However, in discussing and learning about the challenges her students were having, she wasn't getting valid responses from her ELLs. We realized, gosh, it was too language heavy. There were too many questions. And we didn't need 3 questions to get an idea of if the student could recall something from the story. And then besides that, it didn't have these language supports that we know that our students really benefit from, which, as you can see here, are visuals, right? A word bank, a chart showing the days of the week from the daily adventures of our Mr. Caterpillar here. So with this new assessment task that was redesigned in what I like to call an assessment makeover, the children were much more easily able to demonstrate what they know. So just a quick tip there on what are we doing in terms of assessment design? Is it appropriate? The third tip that is, I know, a reminder for a lot of us here as ELL specialists is just remembering that, again, there's this intimate connection between instruction and assessment. Okay, so with that said, we want to be sure that we're engaging all of the language domains in our instruction and in our assessment. Okay, we often over-rely on the receptive domains, particularly in instruction. Okay, I do a lot of work coaching teachers and evaluating teachers with leaders, and do walkthroughs in rooms and have observations of teachers, ELL and content. And one of the things that we'd like to do is notice how many times students are reading, how many times they're listening, how many times they're writing and speaking, and even take count of the minutes, right? Because if the students are not having the opportunity to speak or write much during, say, a 45-minute lesson, then how do we expect their language development to increase, right? So we want to be providing the conditions for the students to be using all of these language domains so that they can foster their language development. In our work tonight, we're really going to be focusing on writing, okay? So we're going to be focusing on how do we analyze when students produce writing. You can do the same process that I'll share with you with speaking. And some teachers that I work with record students, just like you might on the access test. They record a little nugget of a student talking using academic language, and they do the same snapshot protocol with them, and it works out great. It's just writing is a little easier because we can capture it and we can showcase it over time. Okay, so we want to also be reminded that our students have variant English language development levels, and of course ELD is standing for English Language Development. And I would love to know from you if you think that English language development is a linear process. And I believe that we have a poll question for that. There you go. So go ahead, tell us what you think. Oh, I guess I have to. No, I don't. Okay. Thank you so much, Shireen, for compiling that data. Yeah, and we're overwhelmingly saying, no, it's not. A couple not sure, and then some people saying yes. So let's unpack that. Language development is just that. It's developmental, okay? And that means that it's a normal process, right, that students shouldn't be penalized for not reaching proficiency, because proficiency is the goal. Okay, like in this case with the WIDA levels here, proficiency would be level 6. But students are going to take probably several years to reach that level of proficiency. And proficiency is measured by the access test yearly for those of us in WIDA states, or whatever state assessment we have for language. And that measures proficiency. But what we focus on formatively in the classroom is development. And development is not linear. Development is messy. Development is fluid, okay? While proficiency provides that snapshot, we can look at many different snapshots over time if we look at English language development in the classroom. There's so many factors that influence students' language, right? When you think about who our students are, all the myriad of different factors they bring to the classroom, their background knowledge, their culture, their experiences, how they feel that day, their social emotional well-being, all those things definitely come to mind. So I just want to make it very clear that this is just a snapshot, that any given assessment in any given moment is literally just a snapshot into that student's developmental process, that there's a lot of variance within each English language development level and across content areas, as I'll show you an example of in a little bit. Tip 5, we want to be really using the tools that we have at our hand. And again, because I'm a WIDA trainer and I work in WIDA states, the tool that I readily use is this great speaking and writing performance definitions tool from WIDA. If you're in California, you have your tools there that are very similar, as well as Texas and Florida, adopting WIDA. But at any rate, use what you have available and know that they're there for you, and they're available for this very purpose. Okay, some schools that I work with use the WIDA writing rubric instead of this, and that's fine, right? It's the same idea. It depends on how descriptive you want to be and what pieces you want to use. Some clients that I have, we take this tool and we take the writing rubric and we make our own tool. Okay, we make it more student friendly. I've seen some schools turn it into a school rubric and really make sure that all teachers are teachers of language, and that as they have their ELLs, they're really clear about how that interfaces with the content development. There's lots of tools out there, okay, but I want you to just pick one if you haven't. I'm sure a lot of you are ELL teachers, but using one and promoting it in your work so that everybody's speaking the same language about English language development. A quick note here about the WIDA can-dos. The new can-do key uses came out from WIDA, and that might also be a tool for you to use formatively as well. And again, go ahead and share ideas as they come up. And I see just a quick question here. I want to make sure that I've got it. So yeah, okay. So examples of the adaptive tools that I use. That's a great question. So I'm not going to be able to share the adapted tools. I don't have permission to do that from the districts. Somebody was asking about getting to see the examples of the tools. But what I can tell you is that what's been successful is schools take this very tool right in front of us and say, okay, we're gonna just change the language a little to make it make sense for our students. This is a high school that I worked with, so that they turned it into, one school said we're going to turn it into I can statements. Another school said we're just going to make it like a short bulleted list, longer sentences, shorter sentences, phrases, keep it really, really simple. So again, I don't have examples, but I encourage you to think creatively about who needs it, and if it's the students, what would they need to see to make it comprehensible? If it's other teachers, maybe content teachers, what would they need to see to make it more comprehensible? Or just use it as is and see what happens. So the next tip that I'm going to drill into here is this language lens, okay, that I like to talk about in terms of getting really clear about what is it that we want our students to do, what is the language we want them to have. Sometimes we focus so much on what we want them to do, like discuss or read or you know, a match or list, but we're not always clear about what is the language exactly that they're going to be shooting for. Okay, so here's an example. I'm going to move through this example of a third grade task around the water cycle, where the teacher got really clear about what the expectations were for the students at each of these levels, which are from this tool. Okay, we have the word and phrase level, we have the sentence level, and then we have the discourse level. So this is a very important step that I found to be useful in working with schools and state agencies to get very, very crystal clear about what we want the students to produce. If we don't get clear about the academic language demands, then how can students be clear of what they need to do? So that can be used for summative and formative assessment alike, getting clear about language demands. And one of the tools that we use for this in our work is taking this idea of word, phrase level, sentence level, and discourse level, and just do a text analysis with teachers. So they take the textbooks that they're working on with students, or even a lesson, and they analyze the text or their instructional language even, and say, you know, what is it that's tricky about this text for my students? And just spend some time unpacking these language demands so that, again, everybody's really clear about what those goals are. So it's kind of slowing down, putting on that language lens, and preparing ourselves to support our students very explicitly. So then when we have our students' samples, and again, we're going to look at writing, I really want to stress that this is just one example of, documenting English language development. I really just want to share with you this one example, but please know that it's not the only example, okay? What I would like us to be clear about is that just like the tools that we looked at, you know, pick something that works for you, adapt it for your local needs, and then use it, you know, own it, internalize it, share it, make it part of your culture. Because I've found that when we make these formative assessment practices just part of our culture, it's something that happens more and more systematically, and something that is really great for kids and really great for teachers to have an asset-based growth mindset that I will show you. So this language snapshot protocol is a very, very simple approach, and it's designed to work specifically with samples of student writing, as I said, or speaking from English language learners, and starting with their strengths. And basically that's the first step, is what can the student do? Okay, not moving into what can they not do, or as I like to say, what are the opportunities or challenges. You notice I use the sign delta. I use plus delta. That comes from the reading background. And its miscues are not necessarily mistakes, right? They're just windows into the student's language and literacy development. So it's never plus minus. It's plus delta. It's what are the opportunities, what are the challenges. But we don't even want to start there. We really want to start with what can they do, so that we can capitalize on where they're at. We can mark their development in time, and then we can move towards the challenges and the next steps, which is very, very important in terms of what is the information we're going to give the students so that they can know what to do. Because remember, we said formative assessment is all about us and the students, but mostly the students. So we really want to keep that in mind. And you can see at the bottom of this slide here that you're welcome to jump on that site and download it. We're also going to share with you a great collection of resources that the Cal team put together that we've recommended around this topic. So stay tuned for that too. So I'm going to show you how to do this protocol. But first, I'd like for you to take a moment and read this student sample to yourself. Okay, and remember, this was that third grade example around the water cycle, as you can see. And what we do then is we look at what's going on at the word level first, or you can start at the discourse level or the sentence level. But here we're going to pop out what are those tier 1 words and expressions that are coming out. So you can see tier 1, if you know that, and maybe you don't, but tier 1 vocabulary are those everyday common words and phrases. So the student clearly has water, clouds, oceans, right, and even some expressions like stick together, goes on and on, right? So starting to develop some of those English-specific phrases and collocations. And then we move through to these green phrases or green words that are going to pop out, which are tier 2, and those are more content-specific. So in this case, we have gather, we have phases, we have flows. Those are science words, moving into science and math disciplines and getting more specific or technical in the student's language development. The third tier are these yellow words that are popping up, which are really the most technical kinds of vocabulary. And you can see that. They're very, very specific to the water cycle, to the study of this topic, evaporates, water vapor, atmosphere, and the like. So this student is showing some command of these tier 3 words. Okay, then we can move on to the sentence level, and again, the same piece of writing, but with this new lens of what's going on at the sentence level, we can first see that the student has those transition words that we were looking for to connect sentences together. That's terrific. And moving on, he has a more sophisticated language patterns in his sentences. So instead of saying the water cycle is, or the water cycle has, or the water cycle over and over and over again, he has variance. And you can see the variance in his sentence patterns by reading even just the first couple words of each sentence. So he's using different kinds of phrases like as water vapor comes up. And of course he doesn't say comes up, that second yellow sentence here, but he's saying as water vapor up. But we know what he's trying to say. He's got the gist of it, and he's using more sophisticated language at the sentence level. So those are some examples there. And then moving on to the discourse level, well, that's really what's going on with extended amount of text, and how is he connecting and organizing ideas together. And in the discourse of science, does he sound like a scientist? So yes, we can say he's moving towards that, right? He's really talking, again, with some more expanded language, some more sophisticated language to express himself. And then at this point, to get this snapshot of his development, we can go back to our tool. Okay, so we could really have a really deeper discussion about this. If I were facilitating this with a team of teachers, I would have them come up with the words and find where he is, right? So I'm pointing out that he's a level 4 right here. But we could argue, we could have some deliberation, like, well, maybe he's moving towards level 5. Well, how do you know? Pull out the evidence in the student work. Show us it, really, really calibrate it with the tool and with the student work. And same with the sentence level. I'm putting him here, and the teacher, this is really where she put him, was at the sentence level, because he's starting to sound like using the sentences of the science class, but not quite where she wants him and where her non-ELLs might be. And then you can see the discourse level, he's not quite at a level 4. So he's starting to put sentences together, these multiple related ideas, but she's looking for a little more cohesion, a little more different kinds of sentences and the like. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment and see if people have any specific questions about this part of the process. Because I know I get a lot of questions about this in my work, and one of it is, but wait, what if I say that a level 2 is your level 3? That's a big question that comes up. And again, deliberate, that's the point. Take the tools, make them your own, have conversations about student work. And in some of the teams that I've worked at, they have to define what an expanded sentence is, right? So in the green column here on level 3, that's where he put him. Well, I've had really, really intense discussions with teachers saying, well, I don't think that's an expanded sentence, and we get out our language lens and we really think about, well, what's an expanded sentence versus a complex sentence? And those are great conversations to have. So that goes back to that value of looking at student work together. Well, once we have an idea of where the student is, in this case we'll call him Franco, then we want to have a way of documenting it. So as I said here, you can use the tool and just circle it, or you could come up with your own system. In some of the work I've done in supporting teams, we actually make charts like this, or you know, have a checklist or something that teachers can use and teachers can own so that they're using it in their practice. Again, so that the point is the next steps instruction. So this was the teacher's process, okay? She saw the strengths, a lot of the same things that we saw. She saw the challenges, and she wanted to go right away to the next steps. But slowing her thinking down in this process helped her get really clear about what would be the next steps for Franco. She decided that he really would benefit from the self-editing checklist. That as a third grader, he was becoming more autonomous. He could really spend some time checking his work and also using graphic organizers and the support of word banks. And he really didn't have that word knowledge down yet. He needed the support to perform at that level, so she wanted to continue to give him that. Because after all, language supports are scaffolds, because English language, being an English language learner is typically not a permanent situation, or we hope. So we want to be sure that we're scaffolding and that we're taking the supports away over time. So we want to be really, really clear about what those next steps are. So we're not overdoing it with supports, or we're not underdoing it. We're doing exactly what that student needs to move forward. And you might be saying to me, but wait a minute, that was a really sophisticated example. What about a level 1? I have a student that's writing half in Portuguese, half in English, or just drawing. Well, you can do the same thing. You can pull out what's going on at the word level, even if they're cognates. In this case, you can see what the student is writing about. You know, in sentence level, there are sentences coming together here. You know, you can place this student on the performance definitions, on the rubric. And at the discourse level too, you can really take some time and go through this process with any piece of student writing. I'm just going to take a moment and quickly look at the questions. So a preferred rubric. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a complicated question. People are asking about rubrics. If you have a preferred rubric, I say, you know, if you're a WIDA state, my recommendation is start with the WIDA tools because that's what they're there for, and go with that, and then adapt it if you want, you know, to meet your needs. But use the levels that your state has agreed to, and some kind of way to calibrate them against the levels. So moving towards the final couple steps here. Once we have the feedback for the students, we want to have that goal-setting conversation with them. And we don't want to give them a page of red marks all over an essay, right? Because that doesn't work. Okay, research around literacy and language and any kind of one-on-one instruction, which I would argue is formative assessment, says that 1 or 2, maybe 3 teaching points per student. Keep it close, keep it short and sweet, and keep it reasonable for the students. Here's some examples of students setting goals and writing them on Post-it notes and putting them in their writing folder. And in the background, you can see an example of a student writing journal where the teacher's giving him, in this case, giving her the sentence stems, but then having her work through how to organize her work in the journal. And then what's great is over time we can flip through that journal and we can see, wow, that student has made a lot of growth. So here are some ideas about how to support them, because we keep talking about language supports and we keep talking about, well, what are those next steps for those students? This is not an exhaustive list, right? There are many, many, many strategies out there to engage students in language differentiation. These are some high leverage ones that I see in my practice, particularly with writing. I would say sentence frames are a big one right now, and I'd be curious to see if other people have that experience as well as the self-assessment that this teacher used, and even peer assessments. Actually, I know a teacher a couple weeks ago who said, hey, I have my kids do, I have my 8th graders do a plus delta on their own work. I use the language snapshot on them. They do it on themselves and then they do it on each other. That's great. You know, take that to the next level and have students own it, because the more that students own the work, the more internalized that it will be. So I would love to invite you to add anything that you don't see on this list. If if there's something on here that should be on here, go ahead and jot it down for us. Or if you have a favorite one here, like I said, if sentence stems, for example, is a favorite one, let's hear from you. So please take a minute and add to the question box either a strategy here that you really like or a strategy here, or strategies that's not here, that should be here. Okay, so mentor text, great. Yeah, showing students what it should look like. So if the Franco, for example, was writing about the water cycle, he was looking at examples of that. Mentor text is a great idea. Shared partner reading, someone else is saying, thanks Teresa. Bringing in each other, having students use the partner support, as well as using the first language. Thanks Maria. Yeah, so definitely bringing in that first language. You can't underestimate that enough. It's very, 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 very critical to use what works for your students. And for many of them, they have that language in their first language. So use it to get to the target language. Absolutely. And again, there's no one size fits all, but support really does make a difference. This is Franco, who we just looked at, and this is his writing on the left. And then this is his writing 3 weeks later on the right. Granted, the left is a narrative piece. The left piece is narrative, and the one on the right is expository. So that goes to show that proficiency changes. It's messy, right, across content areas and from day to day. But you can see that with the supports, Franco was able to produce much more language and much more sophisticated language. In fact, I wanted to share with you a few words from this teacher, Michelle, who I was working with on this. And she said, when I gave him the sentence stems, the word banks, and the visuals, he contributed to class discussions more than he ever had before. I could see a higher sense of confidence and a higher sense of motivation than I had ever seen. I gave him his before and after, so she showed him basically his portfolio, and he hadn't even known how much he'd grown. She said he has a sense of pride in his work like never before, and her goal for him is to teach him to create his own graphic organizers so that she's not always helping him fill it out, but he's moving to the next level so that he can actually create them himself. So she's fostering independence with him, and we're seeing quite a difference in his work, so that's great. Finally, the last tip that I can't stress enough is once we know these tools and practices, and I know many of you do in your roles already, so this is probably a lot of review, but try to codify them, try to come up with a tool or a system like the one I shared with you here, or even this data wall that a classroom teacher did of her students, and really not just own it, but share it, right? Because in some way, shape, or form, those of us closely with English language learners, we really become ambassadors of them, and ambassadors teach other people what that population needs and works to educate. So if we have this assessment literacy, then I do believe, it's partly within our responsibility to share that. And again, using the question box, go ahead and add any ideas that you might have for sharing assessment literacy, because this is a big topic in the ELL world or not, right? Assessment literacy and designing valid assessments and fair assessment design is a very difficult thing for some of us, for a lot of us. I know it certainly is. So I'm going to be stopping there and just quickly summarizing these 10 tips so that you have them all together. And I'm just going to look really quickly at the chat here at some of these that are coming up about, using routines is a really big, academic conversations is a popular strategy. Somebody's asking, I have different English language proficiency levels, so how do I take this tool and how do I do this for language assessments? Yeah, it definitely, when we don't have all the time in the world, I understand what you're saying. That can be really challenging. So again, I would just say, what do you need? Do you need your students to have formative feedback? Is it all of your students, or is it a couple priority students? For some of the teams I work with, it's, I've got these 3 kids I really need support on. Or maybe it's my whole class. And if it's the whole class, try to find the time to do it. And maybe it's just once a quarter, right? So finding the time and finding the purpose so that it works for you. Great. So I want to make sure that everybody sees the resources that are listed up here, but they're also on a wonderful page that Cal put together that I encourage you to check out if you haven't already. I think it'll be on the archive site, and there'll be hyperlinks to all of these pieces here, so check it out. And if you're interested in staying in touch with us, we do online courses using Schoology, and we're launching a May course around this topic. And then we're also doing our most popular course, which is Connecting with Families, or Strong Homeschool Connections. So if you're interested in working together more, please let us know. But otherwise, I would like to start to transition into the question and answer by first thanking the folks on the left of this slide for sharing their work in this PowerPoint, in this presentation. There's some teachers that, like I said, I've been really fortunate to work with and have been able to share their work with us this evening. And then in the right column, of course, are our resources and our friends in the field that study this work so that we can bring it into our practice. And then finally, again, that hashtag, as we know, is the hashtag EdConnect. So please stay connected. Let us know these questions. I'm seeing some really great questions come up that deserve time and space that we may not get to tonight. So let us know, see what we can do to keep the conversation going on Twitter. Otherwise, I would definitely like to hand it back over to Shireen, who will be facilitating the question and answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredibly informative and very interesting to hear. As you probably have seen, we've gotten in some exciting questions about tonight's content, so I thought maybe we could spend the next few minutes and do a little mini Q&A. Sarah, one of the questions that came in tonight is from Beth, and she asks, have teachers taken their own tests and analyzed their own language use? What supports would help teachers and students get there?
Thank you so much. So it sounds like Beth is wondering more about that assessment design piece that we talked about in the beginning. Yeah, I guess I would really promote this idea of getting clear about the demands of our content area. So for example, if I am teaching science, like Michelle was in this example, I want to get very crystal clear about what is it that's hard, the language of science, and particularly what is hard about the language of the water cycle in this case, and do some kind of analysis like the one that I shared about what is going on at the word and phrase level, what is going on at the sentence level, what is going on at the discourse level, and go through that structured process to just slow down and use that language lens to try to predict, essentially, try to predict what the kids might trip up on. So I think that same process is successful in assessment design. There's a lot of great resources out there on assessment design, and the ones that we're sharing with you on the site, I highly recommend. I'm just trying to think of exactly which one would be in that direction, Beth, but probably the West Ed has an assessment design toolkit that I've used in my work, and here in Massachusetts with the state and with some of the local school districts, and kind of are we on the right track? Are we having culturally and linguistically unbiased assessments? I mean, that's a whole other topic, in terms of doing it really well. But I think if I'm hearing you right, that getting clear about language is part of it, and then getting clear about is it measuring what it's supposed to measure? So I hope that helps.
Great. I hope so too. I think it seems like a very informative response. Another question we have is also to do with the language assessment that you were discussing earlier in your presentation. And Ms. Valdez would like to know, what are some of the districts who have engaged in the work of formative language assessment for English learners?
Let me unmute myself. So thank you, Ms. Valdez, for your question. And I can tell you that most recently in my work here in Massachusetts, where I'm based, I've been working with many districts on this topic, where we do sort of a review of the WIDA framework tools, and then we say, well, what can we do with them to help us move forward? And assessment, because as we know, it is such an important issue and often very misunderstood, particularly around this issue of proficiency versus development, that districts do want to go a little deeper. And in Massachusetts, the ones that I mentioned before on the screen were some of the districts that have been doing this work, like the Enlace Academy in Lawrence, Massachusetts, actually has the whole WIDA framework built into their, they have their whole WIDA framework built into their lesson plan. In fact, if you're going to be at the WIDA conference, come see us, because we're going to be sharing the Enlace model, the Lawrence Enlace Academy model of how they do curriculum design really deeply in this way. So that's a great example, as well as the other districts I mentioned here. And I've worked with Worcester, I've worked with Barnstable. Other urban districts include Malden, Everett, Framingham, and there's several other that don't come to mind right now, but those are the ones that I've been doing this deeply with in the last year or so. And then in my work in Wisconsin, before that, I was doing this work in the schools I worked in out there. So, you know, it develops over time, and I learn more and more, constantly trying to have professional learning myself about what makes strong language assessment for ELLs. I highly recommend the book that is mentioned on the resource sheet. That is by Castro, Bowles, Cook, McDonald. It's called Formative Language Assessment for English Learners. It's developed by many of the folks from WIDA who did a whole formative assessment study called FLARE, F-L-A-R-E, where this process was inspired by partly. And they go into much more depth in terms of a four-step process, in terms of language goals, success criteria, and the like. And I would say, too, finally, that I was brought into the work of assessment and curriculum design at the Massachusetts Department of Education. And we, again, relied heavily on those resources in our work, where a lot of this work evolved from. So those are the resources I can point out for you, and those are some of the districts that come to mind.
Great. Another question that we got in from Ms. Catherine Hennessy is this the kind of analysis best done in a group when you first start using the performance definition? I can see this being used in professional learning communities for ELD data analysis.
That's an awesome question, and I would say, you know, analyzing student work assessment, just like teaching, is a cyclic process. So anywhere you enter the cycle is fine. If you come in the cycle through assessment design, as Beth pointed out, that's great. If you come in the process or the cycle through analyzing student work, that's great too. If you come in through instruction, that's also great. So if I were to lay it out as a cycle, you know, it would be teach, plan, assess, reflect. So teach, plan, assess, reflect. And if you know, if I'm hearing that person's question correctly, it sounds like they're saying, could we start by analyzing student work or just examining the rubric at a professional learning community? Absolutely. But the idea is keep going, right? So whatever you learn, put it into practice, whether the next step is teaching or the next step is assessing or reflecting. But I would say anywhere in that order would be a fine place to start.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question, and this comes from Lindsay Massoud. She would like to know, can the WIDA tools provide insight as to which language features to focus on with the particular student when providing feedback? In other words, should we look at students' levels and focus on language skills that might be present at that or at the next level?
Lindsay, I'm so glad you asked that question, because as we know, language is fluid and it's messy, as we've said, and also we shouldn't be capping students at that level. So when I hear someone say, oh, well, that child's a level 2, she's a level 2, she can't do that, it's like, well, wait a minute, you know, what was she a level 2? She was level 2 at that point in time with that assessment. Let's look at her now. Let's do a formative check. Let's start with her work. Okay, we could start with the level and say, okay, we know she's around level 2, but let's look at this point in time and let's look at her work and see where that brings us. Again, so that we're being realistic, we're being in the moment with the student, but that, as we're stressing too, we're not capping them at that level, that we're always doing what those of us in the field of ESL, if we've been in the field for a while, we know that it's called I+1, input plus one. You know, it's the zone of proximal development. It's where they're at, and then go a little bit further just to give them that stretch, to give them that challenge.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank Ms. Sarah Ottow for sharing her expertise with us today, and to each of you for joining us and taking the time to participate in today's webinar. It's unfortunate that we've run out of time. We had a lot of great questions, and I hope everybody continues the discussion online. We'd also like to extend one final invitation to connect further with each other and collaborate further, as well as talk to each other on Education Connections. Feel free to reach out to our team at edconnect@cal.org with any questions you may have about the webinar or the community. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.